positive force or a negative force, whether belief in God, belief in religion is an obstacle to, or is it a pathway to understanding and to change the world and to emancipate humanity. And what we have today on our panel are two speakers, both of whom have played very active roles in their lives in the struggle for liberation. They're going to present their views about the topic that is before us today. So what I'm going to do is to introduce the speakers, and then each one of them will speak for 15 to 20 minutes. I think there's an echo here, yes? Okay. Each one will speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we will throw it open to the audience for questions, comments, brief questions and comments, and brief comments and questions, and then afterwards we'll have opportunity to have an informal discussion with the speakers. And we don't have a lot in the way of refreshments, but there's some water around somewhere, I think, so that we can, while we're having our informal discussions afterwards. So I'm going to proceed to introduce the two speakers, and then I will turn it over to them. Our first speaker is Sunsara Taylor. She is a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. She writes for the party's newspaper, The Revolution. Right. Supporter of the newspaper, The Revolution. She considers herself an uncompromising atheist. She is presently on a national tour of campuses in which she is discussing and promoting a book entitled Away with All Gods, Unchanging the Mind and Radically Changing the World, written by Bob Avakian, who is the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. She has written pieces for the New York Times. She's appeared on the O'Reilly Factor. That must have been quite a show. She's been on CNN's Show Business Tonight. She also co-hosts a radio show on Pacifica, which is entitled Equal Time for Free Thought. And she has participated also as an activist in liberation struggles. She has participated in protection of abortion clinics when those who wanted to deprive women of that right were trying to do so. She has spoken at over 50 campuses together with veterans of the Iraq War against the war in Iraq. She has written articles in addition to The Revolution in Counterpunch, TruthDig.com, The Humanist Magazine, and others. And so we're talking about a person who is both a prolific thinker and a prolific activist. And the same is true of our second speaker today, Minister Robert Muhammad. Minister Muhammad is the Southwest Regional Minister of the Nation of Islam. And he also hosts a radio show on KPFT entitled Connect the Dots. He has been, and all of us in the audience know him, as one of the leading activists in Houston and in the state against police brutality and racial profiling and the death penalty and against the war in Iraq. He was the spiritual advisor for two individuals who were executed in this state, very controversial executions, Odell Barnes and Shaka Sankofa. He was one of the organizers of the 1995 Million Man March to Washington, one of the organizers of the 2000 Million Man Family March. He was one of the participants in the struggle to preserve Allen Parkway Village and to work for decent housing for those who were displaced from Allen Parkway Village. So again, we're talking here tonight two speakers, both of whom are prolific thinkers, prolific activists, and that's my spiel. And so now I'm going to turn it over to those you really want to hear from. First, Sunsara Taylor, and then after that, Minister Robert Muhammad. Can't hear us?
I didn't write for the New York Times. I've been written about in the New York Times. And I'm a supporter of the Revolutionary Communist Party. As he said, my name is Thurgood. Oh, hi, can you hear me now? No. Can you hear me now? No. Can you see me? Okay, let's see. We're going to turn this one off or put it away. There we go. I'm going to see if this will fit in. Okay, we're going to just pretend like we're doing a stage performance. Okay, everybody can hear me okay now?
That's better.
Okay, well thanks for persevering. So, as he said, my name is Sunsara Taylor, and I came down. I'm very happy to be here. I was just telling Minister Muhammad, I've heard things about him from activists, from people who have tremendous respect for the work he's done, and it's all, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And it's all too rare that we have this kind of exchange, a very frank exchange over religion, over morality, over the existence or non-existence of God, among people who are more or less on the same side of fighting against oppression and injustice. And I think it's very important to have this conversation, and I just wanted to start by saying that. And when I flew down here yesterday, I wanted to share this as well. I sat on the airplane next to this man who turned out he was 40 years old, and he struck up a conversation with me, and in the course of this, he was telling me about his religious beliefs, and I told him I was an atheist, and he said, "Oh my God, you're my first atheist I've ever met." And I thought how incredible that is, that he is 40 years old and he's never met an atheist. And it says a lot about how thickly indoctrinated people are with religion from the time they're very young. I myself never met an atheist till I was in college. And I'm just curious to get a sense of who's here. If people can raise their hand if you've never talked to an atheist before. Well, I want to thank you guys for coming out. So, I've been on a national speaking tour, as he said, promoting this book, Away with All Gods, Unchaining the Mind and Radically Changing the World. It's written by Bob Avakian, who is the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party. And what he does in this book is he really gets into the origins of religion, where different religious beliefs come from, and the roles that religion has played. And he gets into why God does not exist, how we know that God doesn't exist, and helping people unravel why, if you grow up in a society that teaches you to believe in God from the time you're little, a lot of people believe this, but it's not true. And then he also gets into, and he understands, the real horrors of this world that makes so many people feel the need for the solace that religion claims to provide, while at the same time understanding that religion stands as an obstacle to people unchaining their minds and being a part of radically changing and liberating the world. So he comes at this topic from the point of view of making revolution and emancipating humanity and seeing the need for the oppressed themselves to be conscious participants in that. And so I'm not going to be able to cover everything in the book, but everybody got this little table of contents on their chair. I encourage people to look at the chapter titles, to look at what's in this book, and to get a copy of it before the night is over. Now, like I was saying, most people in this country, I grew up Christian. I was never extreme in my beliefs, but I also never questioned them. I went to church, I prayed every night, I read the Bible, I went to Sunday school, I went to church camp. And like most people who are religious, there were things that I heard in church or read in the Bible that struck me as profoundly wrong. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I went to a wedding. And it was beautiful. It was the first wedding I'd ever been to, and it's family and loved ones are all gathered. And it was beautiful. I was very moved, and about a little ways into it, the priest pulls out his Bible. And he reads this passage from Ephesians 5:22. And it says, "Women, submit to your husbands as your husbands submit to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church." And even at 10 years old, this struck me as profoundly wrong. And it really hit me. And I just want to pause and have people think about this. Because here's this couple embarking on their life together. And this is embedded in their vows. This is said before family and friends gathered. This is backed up with the weight of Scripture and the authority of the priest and the notion of God himself. That the woman has to submit to the husband as the husband does to the Lord. And you have to think of the weight of that. Not just in my 10-year-old mind, but on the woman getting married, on all the people present, and upon generation of women who've had this preached at them. But then, like most religious people, I also was trained to think that some things are beyond human understanding. So you can push that aside. You go, "Oh, Okay, doesn't make sense, doesn't seem right, but there must be some meaning in it. God is mysterious, so I'll just kind of go on faith. And this happened over and over again. I kept reading things in the Bible or hearing them in church that struck me as very wrong. And it wasn't until many years later, actually, that I ran into some of the earlier writings by Bob Avakian, and he asked me on religion, and he asked me to do something that he also discusses in this book, which once I heard it seemed so obvious, but which no preacher, no Sunday school teacher, no camp counselor, nobody had ever suggested to me before. And that is, he said, when you read the Bible, stop pushing things to the side and actually confront what's really in it. And think about the content of the Bible. And let me tell you, once you strip the Bible of the romance and awe that this society and this culture instills in it, there's absolutely no basis for confusion or blurriness on this matter. The Bible is bloodthirsty. It is filled with moral codes that are oppressive and openly genocidal. It not only condones, but it celebrates the killing of homosexuals in Leviticus, the stoning to death of women who are not virgins when they get married in Deuteronomy, the taking of slaves from rival tribes, and the taking of women as prizes of war and sex slaves. This is all through the Old Testament. This is commanded. And it even includes the cruel notion that sickness is caused by sin. And this is not just one book of the Bible or two books of the Bible that happen to be collected when they put it together. This is the core message of the Bible, the New Testament as well as the Old Testament, and even in the person of Jesus himself. For instance, in Matthew 10:24 through 25, Jesus says, "A disciple is not above the teacher, nor a slave above the master. It is enough for the disciple to be like the teacher, and the slave to be like the master." Jesus did not condemn slavery. He told the slave that it was right for him to obey the master. And these words and this quote from Jesus Christ was used for hundreds of years by slave owners and slave traders to justify that brutal institution, including on this soil on which we're sitting. This is gone into more deeply in the book in a chapter that Bob Avakian calls "The Bible Belt is the Lynching Belt: Slavery, White Supremacy, and Religion in America." And he unravels why this is and the role religion has played. But Bob Avakian also goes further, and he explains why this passage is in the Bible in the first place, as well as all this other bloodthirstiness that I've been talking about. He shows how the Bible was written by human beings, not by a God. And then he discusses who the people were who actually wrote the Bible. He says the authors of the Bible lived in societies that were constantly at war with each other over land and custom. They lived in slave-owning agrarian societies. They were patriarchal societies some 2,000 years ago. And they did stone women to death if they weren't virgins. They did kill children if they were disobedient. And they lived in a society where those were the moral codes of the time. So when those human beings made up myths to explain things they did not yet understand, the myths they made up and the gods they invented and wrote down reflected the society and the morality and the ignorance of the times in which they lived. And it makes sense that religious authorities and reactionary rulers have picked up on and used and reinterpreted these myths for centuries to reinforce oppression and ignorance right down to today. And the history of the spread of religion is the history of one people conquering another, the history of torture and genocide or near genocide, the suppression of science and inquiry, and the rape and plunder of women, that is, half of humanity. Of course, there are and there have been and there will be people who have fought against injustice and oppression motivated by religious beliefs. And I have and will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. But I have to insist that these people, when they do this, they're doing this in spite of the core message of their scriptures, not because of it. At the core, I want to go back to Christianity and dig a little further into what is at the core of Christianity. And you can get at this by the creation story, the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man. And I say this is the core of the story where Eve tempts Adam to eat the tree from the tree of knowledge, to eat the fruit from the tree of knowledge, and then they this is the original sin. They fall out of the Garden of Eden and everything breaks loose from there, and all the horrors and wars and mayhem and everything is allegedly caused by that. And I say this is at the core because this scripture, this parable, this myth actually, is both how Christianity explains the origins of human society and everything that's unfolded since then, and the whole reason why you need Jesus Christ. There is no Christianity without this story. If you didn't have the original sin and the fall of man, you have no need for a Savior to come back and redeem us. So I want to dig in. What's the content of this core message? There are two big things that jump out. The first is that acquiring knowledge is sinful and only gets you into trouble. And this is, I'll come back to this. But the second thing is that women are blamed for this original sin. And because of this, women are forever cast as temptresses, as more emotional and less rational, and as untrustworthy. And a special curse is put on women. According to the Bible, and this is repeated by Paul through Timothy and other chapters, women can only redeem themselves by obeying and submitting to men, and by guarding their virginity until they're married, and then breeding children for their husbands. But this has nothing to do with the will of God. This has to do with the will of human beings, the male patriarchal authorities who made up and wrote down the myths of the Bible. But yet, these myths and assumptions have mangled and crippled the lives of millions of women for centuries. This is the content of the Bible, and it commands treating women as property. And you cannot separate this myth and this commandment from the kinds of things that we saw in the photo of Rihanna, with her face all swollen and bloody. Everybody saw that picture. This was just putting on the front page something that goes on behind closed doors in the privacy and the sanctity, quote unquote, of the family every 15 seconds in this country. As we sit here, it's going on. And every day in this country, 3 women are killed by their partners. You cannot separate this from a culture and a morality that treats women as property of men. And this is at the core of Christianity. In reality, and in opposition to this poisonous religious morality and male supremacy, I want to quote briefly from a special issue of Revolution that we put out called A Declaration for the Liberation of Women and the Emancipation of Humanity. It says, "Women are not breeders. Women are not lesser beings. Women are not objects created for the sexual pleasure of men." And I would add, there is nothing sacred about motherhood, and absolutely nothing wrong with choosing not to be a mother, including choosing to have an abortion. Quoting again from the Declaration, it says, "Women are human beings, capable of participating fully and equally in every realm of human endeavor. When women are held down, all of humanity is held back. Women must win liberation, and they can only be liberated through the revolutionary transformation of the world and the emancipation of all humanity, and through being a powerful motive force in that revolution." So religion is harmful because of its content, but religion is also harmful because it trains people not to think. Just like it trained me to push aside Ephesians 5:22, and it trains you in the fall of man story that seeking knowledge is the cause of troubles, it also trains people in this kind of slavishness and accepting oppression. Recently, I was on a radio show, and I was talking about the fact that because of the U.S. wars and occupation, there are now 740,000 widows in Iraq. That's 1 out of every 11 women between the ages of 15 and 81 is a widow. So without missing a beat, this host says to me, he goes, "Well, God works in mysterious ways. It must have been their time." And I want to say this was not a reactionary radio host. This was a very progressive black radio host up in Harlem, who himself is against the war. But here, in the face of an actual atrocity, a crime against humanity, he was throwing up his hands and saying there must be some meaning in this. Religion makes people slavish, unthinking, accepting of their own oppression and of others. In reality, there's nothing mysterious about it. The U.S. launched a murderous and unjust war, and people in this country did not do enough to actively resist and to stop that war. And so now there are 740,000 widows in Iraq. That is perfectly unmysterious. It is perfectly intolerable.
and throwing up your hands, saying God works in mysterious ways, is perfectly immoral. Or how many of you here know the story of Oscar Grant? Oscar Grant was a 19-year-old black man who was out with his friends on New Year's Eve in Oakland. But then, for no reason, a bunch of Oakland police pull him and his friends off the train and shove them to the ground. They handcuffed him. One cop put his knee on Oscar Grant's back, on the back of his head. Another cop pulled out his gun and at point blank shot him in the back as he was handcuffed. Anyone who doubts this can see the whole thing on YouTube, where it was caught on cell phone camera. And in fact, just like the brutal beating of Rihanna was putting in the front pages, something that goes on all the time, this killing of Oscar Grant goes on all the time. The harassment, brutality, and killing of black and Latino youth by the police. So understandably, and righteously, there were huge protests in Oakland. But what I want to talk about is what happened at Oscar Grant's funeral. Because right at his funeral, his priest gets up and says, I knew Oscar Grant. I thought he was going to grow up to be a man of the cloth. And he pauses, and then the priest says, but I guess God had other plans. Well, here we go again. Just like with the 740,000 widows in Iraq, if God had a plan, that is one truly messed up plan. And that kind of God is not the kind of God that any sane or decent person should want to bow down to. And it is a very good thing, and indeed a truly liberating thing, to come to the realization that no such God exists. It is long since time that people got up off their knees and stopped praying to gods that don't exist and start fighting for revolution, for liberation, in this world, the real world, the only world there is. As Bob Avakian writes in this book, Away with All Gods, he says, quote, oppressed people who are unable or unwilling to confront reality as it actually is are condemned to remain enslaved and oppressed. On the flip side, if we want to do away with oppression, we have to look at it. We have to study and understand the source of it. And we have to act to change it in this world. The way in the real world to end exploitation and oppression and the many forms of degradation that plague humanity today is through revolution, through communist revolution. This is how humanity can finally get free in the fullest sense, where people's material requirements of life, our need for food, clothing, shelter, the ability to raise the next generation, and to be secure in case of natural disasters or other unexpected events, as well as having our cultural and intellectual needs met. To have these met collectively and cooperatively, and where society is no longer divided into oppressor and oppressed. And by revolution, I'm talking about not just a lot of change or a lot of upheaval. I'm talking about the actual overturning of the system that we now live under and the establishment of a new state power, a new economy, new social system, and a whole different ways that human beings can organize our lives. With revolution, many things that seem unsolvable today would be easy to solve very quickly. The Revolutionary Communist Party and Bob Avakian have written much more extensively on this topic than I'll be able to cover tonight, but I want to say some things very clearly about revolution. When we have revolutionary state power, black and brown mothers will not have to fear anymore every time their sons walk out on the street. If they're going to be harassed, brutalized, shot down by the police, or caught up in some petty crime and spend their life behind bars, like 1 out of every 8 young black men currently do. Instead, there'll be meaningful work for the youth, all the youth, because there are real needs to be met. Building housing, helping to design neighborhoods, and other such things that human beings desperately need today. Education will be opened up and everyone will be brought into learning and being a part of administering all of society, of debating policy and making art, of learning from and contributing to teaching others, so that we can all learn and be changing ourselves and changing the world. And our police force in a revolutionary society would be used not to hold people down, but to prevent overthrown or new exploiters from undermining what the revolutionary forces had won. When we have state power, it will no longer be the case that 1 out of every 4 women will be raped in her life, and that women will be dehumanized in a million ways. Imagine if you didn't have to, every time you walk out your door, see women's bodies displayed half naked and half starved, used to sell everything from wars and ideology to cars. Imagine if people were trained, and young boys from the time they're little, to see women as actual human beings. Imagine if women didn't have to fear walking down the street. Imagine if no woman ever again knew what it was like to be forced into motherhood against her will, or to be shamed or blamed if she got an abortion, or if no woman ever knew what it was like to be coerced into sex or to have to sell herself in a desperate attempt to feed herself or her child. That's possible if we make revolution. When we have state power, it will no longer be the case. We'll restructure the entire economy to meet people's needs, as I said, but without exploiting and appropriating that wealth and everything that we use to survive in this country off the exploitation of people, including small children around the world. If we look at our clothes, we can see the labels from Honduras and Haiti and Pakistan of peasants and former peasants and children who make everything for the people who live in the empire to survive. We're going to rebuild our economy and provide housing and for the needs of people without exploiting and plundering the world, and therefore there will be no more imperialist wars. There will be no more Hiroshimas and Nagasaki's. There will be no more Vietnams and Iraq wars. There will be no more drones over Pakistan, which Obama, the new imperialist commander-in-chief, is responsible for as much as Bush was. And finally, with revolutionary state power in the context of meeting the needs of society, individuality and initiative will be unleashed, and there will be a flowering of the arts and culture, of debate and ferment throughout society. And dissent and criticism will be encouraged and learned from, not repressed and silenced. Some say that we communists are no different than religious people, that we too are just promising a heaven that has never been realized in the real world. But communism, as opposed to religion, is a science. Marx, Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Bob Avakian, the leader of the Revolutionary Communist Party, didn't fast and go out in the desert and come back with hallucinations. They studied human societies and nature more broadly. They studied how change comes about in the real world and what are the forces for change in this epoch. And on that basis, they pointed to how these real contradictions could be changed through revolution. And unlike the authors of the major religious scriptures, who wrote about relations of subjugation, oppression, enslavement, and ignorance, these communist leaders wrote about and have given guidance to the process of emancipating humanity, abolishing all class relations of exploitation and oppression, abolishing all relations of production on which these class distinctions rest, abolishing the social relations that correspond to those oppressive relations of production, and revolutionizing even the way people think, all the ideas in society. And finally, unlike the dominant history of religion, which, as I said, has been the history of one people conquering another, of rape, plunder, torture, the suppression of science and inquiry, the actual history of communist revolution has been the most emancipatory and liberating chapters in human history. And there's not time to get into all of this. I'm wrapping up my time here. All of the slanders and distortions that have been heaped on the history of genuine revolutions. Let me put it this way. WMDs are not the only thing that people in America have been lied to about. The history of genuine revolutions you've also been lied to about. To give one example, and I'm talking about in the Soviet Union up into the mid-50s, and in China, particularly between 1949 and 1976 under the leadership of Mao Zedong before capitalism was restored. That's a country that came out of a peasant, oppressed economy where the life expectancy was 32 years old and they raised it to 65. They took literacy from 15% to 80%. They brought women who had their feet bound and crushed, their bones broken. They ended child bride marriages. They ended the binding of women's feet, and they brought women into leading all realms of society together with men. Never before has so much been done so quickly, and with the participation, the conscious participation and activism of tens of millions in China. All this and more is the real-world experience that has been drawn on, together with the broader engagement and struggle in the realm of science and human experience more broadly, by Bob Avakian in developing communist theory even further, to point the way to do even better the next time around. One element of this, and part of what he addresses in this book, is the subject of communist morality, and this is what I want to leave you with. There is meaning and purpose and morality that corresponds to the struggle to change this world, to make revolution, and to emancipate humanity. It is moral to fight against oppression and exploitation and to fight for revolution. And it is moral to live in a way today that is consistent with the world we are striving to bring into being, to challenge all forms of male supremacy and to foster relations of equality and mutual respect between men and women, because that's the kind of world we're fighting to bring into being. To take on all forms of white supremacy and national chauvinism and racism, and to have a movement that forges revolutionary unity between people of different backgrounds and that finds beauty in a diversity of cultures. It is moral to foster a critical spirit and scientific approach, to want to be challenged when we are wrong, and to speak frankly with others when we think they're wrong, so that we can all learn and we can put what we learn in the service of advancing the revolutionary struggle. To value the lives of people around the world as much as our own, and to think about and be stewards of the natural world and humanity's future. This is communist morality. It is rooted in, and it is consistent with, and can guide us as we fight to bring into being a different world, a liberated world. It is far better than the morality of the slave owners and patriarchs of the Christian Bible or the Quran, and it is a morality that is far better than the look out for me and mine at the cost of others that is the morality of the capitalist era. Thank you.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful, I bear witness there is no God but Allah, the witness that Muhammad is his messenger. Just keep listening. You'll hear me in a minute. I want to greet you all in great words of peace of Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. Professor Kleven, and the great professors of Thurgood Marshall, to Sunsara Taylor, staunch revolutionary, very intelligent woman, and I'm not being patronizing. I very much enjoyed her presentation. But I gotta do what I gotta do. Argument is made up of three elements. There's a claim. That claim can come in three forms. A claim of fact, a claim of value, a claim of policy. And when you make a claim, you've got to support that claim. You support that claim with either evidence or you make a motivational appeal. And that claim, that support, has to be backed by a warrant, which means that your sources should be valid, they should be reliable, and they should have integrity. There are three claims here. Claim of fact that God does not exist, a claim of value that communism is better than religion, and a claim of policy that we should abandon God and religion and accept communism. Believe it or not, we agree with some of what has been offered here this evening. However, we're duty bound to correct the error that has been put before us. For the purpose of tonight's exercise, it's not important that you believe what I believe. I'm gonna say it again. For purposes of tonight's exercise, it's not important that you believe what I believe. What is important is that you believe that I believe what I believe. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said to us that of all the knowledge that one may obtain, the knowledge of God is the greatest and most necessary of all knowledge. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad said further, listen, that 98% of the people of earth are without the knowledge of God, the Supreme Being. Claim number one, God does not exist. If the God that Mr. Avakian writes about in his book, I read the book, it's a very good book, very mentally stimulating. And the God that Ms. Taylor describes, and we're discussing here tonight, is a mystery God. Meaning he's unknown. Then she is correct to claim that he does not exist because the mystery God does not exist.
Come on.
The question we must ask is, who is that mystery God that Mr. Avakian and Ms. Taylor described? Where did he come from? The origin of God being invisible, incomprehensible, ethereal, formless, ghost, or spirit, separate and apart from matter, is not from the aboriginal people of the earth, but it began a little over 6,000 years ago, and the earliest recorded proponents of that mystery God were the Greeks. Now, Anaxagoras in the 5th century BC proclaimed God to be, and I quote, infinite, self-moving mind, not enclosed in any body. His successor, Xenophanes, attacked the gods of the Greek pantheon, and specifically the god of the Ethiopians, because that god had a snub nose and black hair. He said God was one and incorporeal, in substance and figure round, in no way resembling man, that he is all sight, all hearing, but breathes not. Plato said, and the Platonic system of thought said that, I quote, that God is supremely real, supremely good, and matter is less real and less good, therefore God must be immaterial. Aristotle said, he named the mystery God the unmoved mover. He said he's pure being, such as eternal, immobile, and spiritual. Since matter is flawed and mortal, there is not material element in God. Plotinus said that God was not a thing, but is distinct from all things. St. Paul of the Bible, his first Athenian convert was a man named Dennis. And he described God as a mystery beyond being, who should be properly called nothing. In his religious treaty, The Divine Names, Dennis says, God is not to be understood, nothing can be said of him, and he cannot be named. Later, in Christian thought, St. Thomas Aquinas picked this up. And he took Plato's mystery God in these words, and he said, in this way, God and the prime matter are distinguished. One is pure act, and the other is pure potency, and they agree on nothing. It was the Hellenistic Jews that introduced this mystery God in the Old Testament. For God was always anthropomorphic to the ancient Jews. They even went into the Bible and changed the Bible so that the word that you see in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is not a singular word. In fact, the word is Elohim, which is plural. And in the original text, in the original language, Elohim is plural, so it would say in the beginning, the gods created the heavens and the earth. So what we're dealing with here is a source that the warrant that she's quoting out of, I believe in the truth of the Bible, but we believe it's been tampered with, must be reinterpreted so that mankind won't be snared by the falsehoods that have been added to it, the ones that she's talking about. Let me read to you from the first page. All you got to do is just open it up to the first page. Containing the old, I ain't making this up, look at it now. Giant print Holy Bible, containing the Old and New Testaments, translated out of the original tongues, and with former translations diligently compared and revised by His Majesty's special command. Now, if he revised, if you go into the dictionary, revise means you changed it. So he changed it. And King James was nobody to be changing what people consider to be the Word of God. I won't even go into his background. I'll leave that alone. I don't want to insult anybody. The Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us for thousands of years, people who did not have the knowledge or the person, the reality of God, worship their own ideas of God. He said the